Welcome. My name is Jerry Bowers, and I'm the Director of Development and Public Affairs here at the MDI Biological Lab. And we are thrilled to have you here with us for our Science Cafe this evening. It's nice to be in our spring season. The weather's beautiful, and it's a great evening to talk a bit about climate change. So that's a big subject. And sometimes I know myself, I feel a little overwhelmed. It's hard to know kind of how to be effective, what to do, what we can do as individuals to do what we can to address climate change and the need for preserving, our environment. So tonight we've assembled a great panel of folks who are going to give us some practical tips on things that maybe here locally, we can do. And I want to just give you a quick sense of who's joining us this evening. Dr. Jane Disney, who's an associate professor here at the MDI Biological Lab in Environmental Studies, is going to be our kind of host this evening and moderate our panel discussion. She will be joined by Lydia Horne, who is a postdoctoral researcher from the University of Northern Colorado, Darren Ranco, who is a professor of anthropology and chair of Native American programs at the University of Maine, along with Jesse Wheeler, who is the vegetation program manager at Acadia National Park. So some familiar faces locally and some new faces to us. And again, Jane, I'm going to throw it to you, just introduce you and welcome everyone to our Science Cafe stage. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation this evening. Thanks so much.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I really feel that I am here to help facilitate the voices of the other panelists who are here. They have very interesting and integrated stories to tell about their experiences working on the climate change front. First, I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit. Some of you I recognize out there, I think, yeah, and others. I have long been working through the Community Environmental Health Laboratory here at MDIBL, and I have many projects that I've come to understand are all related to climate change, because actually everything is, no matter how you're interfacing with the world. And in the let's see, next slide, please. In the community lab, can we have the next slide, Emily? We have a website that we've developed called Anecdata, and we are collecting observations of a changing world. And so many projects on this website, which is actually a citizen science data portal where people can manage information they're collecting about the world and share it with others. On this site, you'll find many projects that are definitively climate change, but then others that are, like I said, related in one way or the other. So next slide. So this website really has its origins in the community lab. As you can see, we've been engaging with people from all over the place, of all ages, in doing all kinds of things, from red tide monitoring to eelgrass restoration, swim beach monitoring. We have people working in the field, on boats, in the lab, collecting just a plethora of information. You can go to anecdata.org and download any of it if you're interested. Take a look for yourself, and I'm always happy to talk to you about it. On Anecdata, we now have over 260 projects from around the whole world. There's over 11,000 users now who have found Anecdata and have decided it's the platform for them. And so I think it's a site that could, anyone could use who wants to start a project. And that's why I thought I'd introduce it tonight in the context of this Science Cafe. And I think I might have one more slide. Yeah, I like to share this particular project out of South Carolina. It's an example of what we call data to action, in that people in South Carolina who entered this project through the South Carolina Aquarium, and a lot of them using their mobile app, have been able to document like 16 1,640 million pieces of trash and figure out where it's coming from and how to mitigate it. And they've taken this information to town councils and to their legislators. And long story short, they've gotten plastic bag bans and styrofoam container bans. You can see the sign on the right. You can't take these things on the beach. Stores don't use them anymore. So it is possible to start with data and end up with something happening. And that's what Anecdata is about. And I think you're going to hear from others tonight how observations of the world or information collected about the world has helped to inform next steps for people. So I want to introduce Darren Ranco from the University of Maine. I would like him to tell a little bit about himself as well, and where his work has taken him and what that has to teach us and inform us about our place in this changing world.
Thank you so much, Jane. Yeah, I'm Darren Ranco. I'm joining you all from Dedham, Maine, in a place that we call Neheme Benage, or Turkey Hill. Anyway, that's just my Penobscot name for it. I'm a citizen of the Penobscot Nation and been working in protecting Wabanaki cultural and natural resources for the last 2 decades. And this is one of our newer projects, started roughly in 2015, but reflects, and I agree with Jane, so many things kind of formulate and move through climate change. I'm going to talk a little bit about the program of research we have with the tribes related to climate change adaptation and climate justice. Next slide, please. So one of the key things that motivates our work is this principle of climate justice, which I know many of you are familiar with, but the idea that some groups of people will be more impacted by climate change and that a just society will build this, I'm sorry, I have a bunch of dogs. A just society will build this disproportionate impact into our climate mitigation and adaptation policies. And in particular for Indigenous peoples, the value of our culture as a part of the resilience and frameworks for our response is a part of this climate justice work. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we do in our research in collaboration with Wabanaki tribal nations is we mobilize engaged forms of research. Some of this looks like community-based participatory research and sustainability science, trying to solve problems that various publics are engaged with, but also, and critically for us with Wabanaki tribal nations, we employ Indigenous research methods which center Wabanaki epistemologies and frameworks of problem solving in our research. And broadly, our work in climate change adaptation understands that the key to adaptation is based on community, social, and cultural resilience. So for Wabanaki communities, we've been really looking at our cultural histories and former adaptations to environmental changes and changes brought on by colonization as parts of our community and social and cultural resilience. And critical to this is thinking about Wabanaki diplomacy as both a place for our work and as well as a process. So next slide. All right, so just a little bit about our territory. I mean, I think everyone knows where the tribes are, hopefully, in what is now Maine. There on the left, you see the location of the 5 reservations, the 2 Passamaquoddy reservations, so the 4 tribal nations, Micmac Nation, Roospan and Micmacs, Holden and Maliseets, 2 Passamaquoddies, and my tribe, the Penobscot Nation. But also, when we have started our work, we've also been thinking about and been tasked with thinking about climate change across all the tribal lands in the state. And so that's the left side of the left slide there, where our lands are located across the state. But what has become really important to the process of our research is when Wabanaki people talk about the space of engagement around collective problem solving, we don't think of ourselves as isolated in what is now Maine. Our territory and our confederacy and our process for engaging our landscape through collective problem solving includes this whole area across the US and Canada border and what we call Wabanaki, or the Greater Wabanaki Territory. So that's where the place of our decision-making frameworks happen. Next slide, please. So as a process, the Wabanaki Confederacy predates the arrival of Europeans. It gets formalized during the early parts of our colonization, but it has been a reflection of a multicultural and multinational set of relations that is deep within our Wampum Belt traditions as collective problem solving, as well as in sort of how to address problems that impact us all. And there's a series of protocols and principles that go along with this collective problem solving, and it's very much tied to place. And it's very much a kind of flexible. In number 2 there, we see a couple of scholars talking about how it's this confederacy or this diplomacy is constantly adapting to external pressures, and it also engages in what would be otherwise called as persuasive discourse. So process traditions around how to make a point and how to respect people in a decision-making process. I will say there's a lot involved in this. One of the key parts of the protocol that we've really mobilized both in our research and our frameworks for collective problem solving around climate change adaptation is this notion in Passamaquoddy language, Sitakwin Dole Westu, like everyone talks or everyone has a place to speak and be heard. And there's a protocol of sort of everyone kind of participating in that kind of structure. Next slide. So in our work, we've identified across the tribal communities as very much a baseline of climate threats. Obviously, like other people in our region, Wabanaki people face changing climates due to increase in degree days, increase in winter ticks. You see that the picture of the moose below that is somewhat threatened, not severely as of yet, but the winter ticks not dying has really threatened some of the moose herd in the state of Maine. We have an increase in invasive species, increase in water temperature leading to impacts on both fish and forest practices. And I think the moose thing and other impacts on culturally important species is really connected to food and sustenance issues, and food sovereignty and climate change, especially for the tribal communities, has become a really critical connection. Next slide. So in terms of the priorities, going back again to the idea that our resilience comes from our past experiences, as well as our knowledge traditions, what we really what has been identified as priorities is really to think of this as a cultural problem as much as a sort of biophysical problem. So really fighting against native language and story loss, and really thinking about those as our keys to sort of adaptability. Again, food sovereignty and connections to food being critical to this. And then acting in terms of priorities across the Confederacy, across this larger landscape. After each community, each nation does their own kind of work. And then with my colleague, Bonnie Newsom, there's a lot of call for and work related to protecting cultural sites threatened by sea level rise and erosion. Again, seeing our past environmental adaptations as a critical part of our future environmental adaptations. Protecting resources and healthy soil, these are things that are critical. But the next slide should be wrapping up. All right, so in terms of mobilizing our work, we're really focused on employing the notion of Wabanaki diplomacy as both a place and process. So for us, I think it helps decenter the idea that it is the state of Maine, which is a relatively new construct when we think about humans adapting to environmental change, and really taking a deep dive into Wabanaki cultural and linguistic and other forms of historical adaptations, and then really linking climate adaptation to climate justice work, wherein Indigenous people are, of course, taking the center stage of globally. And I think here locally, it seems to me that that's going to be a really important part of this next wave of understanding and climate change adaptation. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting, Darren. And I like that, like the number one thing that you mentioned is fighting against this loss of native language, because without that, nothing else can emerge. So thanks for that. And I think we'll be probably returning to this concept of communication, or Lydia, I can imagine that that's very embedded in what you have to talk about. So I'll just turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, I'm going to try to weave some threads with Darren's presentation and talk a little bit about collective decision-making and social resilience, and how we can maybe solve problems or take advantage of opportunities in light of climate change across different geographies. So as was mentioned, I'm joining you from Colorado, but I am from Maine, and I did my graduate work in Maine, and specifically looking at climate change resilience in the tourism industry. And one of my study sites was MDI. Next slide, please. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was an earlier part of this work, which resulted from a visitor survey a couple of years ago and interviewing tourism stakeholders. So people like business owners, nonprofits, public works folks, all of those people who make decisions that impact tourism on MDI were part of this interview. And we asked them what they were most concerned about. What were the top threats in relation to climate change? And animation, Emily. Yeah, thank you. So you can see in this table, the top concerns for suppliers, those living and working on MDI, were of course changes to the natural resource base that could have negative impacts on natural resource activities, including tourism. We also saw concerns for the increasing extreme weather events and the impacts those can have on infrastructure, especially things like island access, right? MDI is unique in that it is an island and of course receives millions of visitors every year. And then the last thing that I've bolded is something I'm going to talk about in the coming slides, but one of the top concerns identified in the interviews was the increase in visitation and how that might actually result in over-visitation or overcrowding. And that of course poses threats to our human and natural systems. And then on the visitor side, we saw concerns about things like ticks and mosquitoes and how also that can impact the natural resources, like Darren, you were saying with the moose, because folks don't just come necessarily to MDI on vacation. And then you see things like extreme weather events, sea level rise, that damage to infrastructure, and then impacts associated with increasing temperatures. Next slide, please. So the next sort of logical step in this work was thinking about, okay, so now we have these things that we're concerned about, but what are we going to do about them? And how can the tourism industry on MDI work collectively instead of individually to address these problems? Or, it's not all negative, right? Alleviating the negatives, but taking advantage of opportunities. So animation, please, Emily. So last spring, a group of researchers at UMaine got together with a group of tourism stakeholders on MDI, and we co-designed and co-facilitated this series of workshops that was thinking about, okay, so what are the things that we're most concerned about in relation to climate change in tourism, and what should we maybe be focusing on in terms of collective action? So the top two concerns that emerged out of this workshop were how can we address changing visitation patterns? And so that's not just an increase in the number of visitors, but it also relates a lot to the changing in the timing of visitation. So for example, more folks might be coming to Acadia or MDI in the winter for various reasons, and how might that impact visitor messaging or safety concerns, for example. And then another thing that emerged from the workshop, which is more of an opportunity rather than something that needs to be alleviated, is this opportunity to model sustainability within Acadia National Park and on MDI. So this is more of a mitigation action, where how can we alleviate the contributions to climate change, and also use tourism to support things that residents and people who live and work on MDI need. And I've put a bullet in here for visitor education, because we're going to talk about that on the next slide, and how that is really could be a key piece of the puzzle in sort of shaping visitor behavior. Next slide, please. This is a lot to look at, but we're just going to focus on the top two boxes. Animation, please, Emily. So in the second workshop, right, we had decided we were going to focus on modeling sustainability and how the tourism industry can address changing visitation numbers. And one of the main strategies, or the things that folks in these workshops identified as a top goal, is thinking about how we can target communication across different user groups. So how can we reach visitors, residents, those who work in the hospitality industry, and provide information about climate change or information about sustainable behaviors? So for example, some of the strategies that were brainstormed in this workshop series were things like, how can we develop media for folks who are now visiting at a different time of year? So they might not be coming in the summer, which has traditionally been the most, have the highest visitation. And what does that mean in terms of managing visitation in the shoulder seasons or in the winter season? And then some other communication opportunities, we're thinking about things like, how can we provide or develop and provide asynchronous hospitality training to, one, increase the capacity of MDI's hospitality industry, but also to provide maybe some educational opportunities about climate change, or some opportunities to think about how the interaction between tourism suppliers and visitors could result in more sustainable climate change behaviors. And then the last two things I think really sort of go together. So there was identified in these workshops a need to coordinate island-wide communication and collaborative efforts. So that's not just saying, okay, well, we're going to work together across all the towns. It means bringing all of the different groups of people to that proverbial decision-making table. So you're bringing in business owners, you're bringing in nonprofits who support recreation, right? You're bringing in all of those different groups to think about how we can create solutions to climate change and how we can collaboratively leverage our knowledge, our skills, and our resources to be better able to achieve those climate change sustainability goals. And so I think this is my last slide, but something that I'm hoping we'll talk about a little bit more is how to connect across communication across different groups, especially between suppliers and visitors, to try to influence those climate-friendly behaviors. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Lydia. That was great. It really sets us up well to listen to Jesse, because he's in the park and he's trying to address some things on the other end, but you again can see where the visitation, depending on how it's managed and where people are encouraged to go or would choose to go, given a broader knowledge of how they can interface with the landscape, will play into what the park is able to do in terms of preserving the park, but not maybe as it is currently forever. So Jesse, why don't you tell us some of the things that you are up to try to address those things that maybe will help to circle back around and inform how we need people to be interacting with the landscape if we're to wend our way through this time of climate change.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jane. So yeah, Jesse Wheeler here. I work at Acadia National Park as a resource manager, and kind of my focus is vegetation. So I deal a lot with vegetation and invasive species. So that's a bit of kind of the context that I'll try to work through how us, park staff and our partners and researchers are working towards how do we deal with adapting to climate change essentially. And so just to kind of reiterate some of the stresses that we're seeing locally, but also regionally and globally on our ecosystems. Invasive species was mentioned already, so these are increasing. So examples would be invasive plants, which have had a competitive advantage with now that we have 2-week longer growing seasons, right, locally. That's just giving more of an advantage to these invasive plants. Invasive forest insect pests. As we have warmer winters, just like with the winter tick example, pests can survive more, and so they spread more readily, and we get more pests on the landscape that way. Suitable habitat for native species and systems are decreasing and or declining, so that could just be from temperature, right? So we have a lot of kind of run at threshold of cold adapted species that occur here on the coast of Maine. So they're just losing habitat. It could be from rising sea levels and stressing those coastal systems, right, for our natural and cultural resources that right along that narrow band of the coastal zone. Fewer birds over the last 50 years. Park Service research shows fewer species of birds just in the last 15 years. And then of course, heat, drought, intense storms. We have about 6 inches more precipitation per year, but a lot of that's really happening in kind of concentrated times of the year. We also have periods of drought in the summer, so that's kind of exacerbating a lot of this. And then I wanted to put visitation in there as well. Yes, it's increasing. Everybody kind of has been around the area in the last couple of years can see that. I initially wanted to qualify it of like, is it a positive, negative thing? Is it both? I think we have challenges and opportunities, and challenges, obviously more people on the landscape. It could be more people coming here seasonally or year round, and that kind of changes the, whether it's development or changing land use. But it's also an opportunity, and I think Lydia did a good job of suggesting some of the opportunities there for connecting with visitors. If we can have the next slide. So a lot on this screen, but I just wanted to propose sort of, so we have all these stresses, so what do we do about it? And certainly I want to say, like, this is from our perspective, but it's going to take a community approach and a large landscape wide approach. And so borrowing some of this diagram from the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network. And so they have some great educational material, but I just want to propose this as sort of when we think about some of these stressors of climate change, in particular disturbance of that climate change may bring, and kind of that frequency and intensity. In addition to invasive species, what do we, where are we going? What are our possible futures? So some examples here are where there's a resistance. So keeping those historical conditions of the forest landscape around, that's going to require work like removing invasive species or preventing certain things from coming in. Resilience kind of is in that maybe Goldilocks zone, perhaps a little bit of the disturbance frequency, where it's probably changing there's some species range shifts happening. There's a little bit of change, but ecosystem functions, sort of those things that provide what makes up an ecosystem still exist and are able to maintain. Some example might be forest fire. If it maintains a certain frequency, you're still going to have forests. Some new tree species may come in, but of course, if it's too frequent, then you might have something like transformation, which is sort of this third concept of too intense, too much, and you really have full ecosystem change. For example, maybe forests turning into non-forested areas, grasslands, desertification. Next slide, please. And so, how do we think about this? And so we're left with recognizing that we won't be able to preserve park resources and park conditions to some historical time frame. Like there's change that's already baked into the system. We've been changing. We will see continued change. But we can look at scenarios, right, of how the climate is going to change and maybe some of these disturbance regimes based on modeling that's out there. And so how can we work that into this climate adaptation framework for decision making, and where we might be able to go, largely we as a community. And so this particular example locally, this map with the dark green on MDI and Acadia lands shows where our dominant red spruce forests are. So red spruce trees make up 4 out of 10 trees here. So that's in a current condition that they're pretty healthy actually. But we could also, using models, look at a near future in decades where those spruce trees are going to die back because of pests, because of increased temperatures. They won't be able to handle those. So what can we do on the landscape and kind of like broadly, but this could also be, think about landowner backyards in a way. So yeah, you can go take that resist route where you're going to try to maintain those same species. That's going to take a lot of effort. We do that with removing invasive plants as an example. There's accepting of that trajectory of, in this example, invasive plants coming in, invasive shrubs in particular, that will likely stop regeneration of a forest and eventually transforming our spruce forest into something else, perhaps. And then there's directing change. And so this one takes a little bit more of a collective thought, I think, and collaboration, but it's something where we in the park are thinking about, so a future forest may look like more of a hardwood forest that's more common to the south. But it'll be quite difficult to have that forest migrate here on its own. So we could be experimenting with transplanting warm adapted species. This might also look like identifying climate refugia. So essentially those areas, maybe those cold pockets that can sustain red spruce and some other cold adapted species. So we can maintain some genetic diversity and some species diversity into a future, even though we may be sort of assisting a migration, or at least looking to how we might adapt into a different forest. So I'll finish with just concluding one cultural resource, at least in terms of historic hiking trails. People might be familiar with the Maple Spring Trail that goes up Sargent Mountain. Well, last June we had a large rain event in MDI. Those who were around saw it, and it completely blew out most of that historic trail. So we're using this framework even within that concept to see how we can address that. So an example might be there where we're resisting change is building it back the same way it was, historic features. That's expensive, takes a lot of resources. Accepting it, so keeping it as is, or closing the trail entirely. Or directing change might look like changing a little bit of the kind of accommodating for those higher rain events. But still having a trail that's there, or looking at reroutes. So there's just some other examples that we're looking at kind of in the facility side. And I just want to conclude that this is something that I think we are struggling with as an agency, but I think it's something that's an opportunity we can also work with our neighbors around in finding solutions.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Jean.
That was a nice introduction to resist, accept, direct. I don't know where I've been, but I've only been hearing about it since this panel has begun meeting. So I guess I've been missing out. I personally have been resisting.
Yeah, I know. It's easy.
Madly replanting eelgrass into the bay. Like this has to still grow here because it grew here 20 years ago. But there are lots of pressures and there's a lot of people too. So superimposed on the backdrop of climate change, we have what I used to teach my students was 6 billion people. And then later I taught them was 7 billion people. But now where are we at? Like, are we getting closer to 8 billion people on the planet? So that, there's just a lot of us. And so our impacts are going to bump up against this other change, the changing climate. And I think that's where the tourism comes in and some of what you're talking about, Jesse, with, maybe we need to accept where we're at and think about how we direct things so that we still have the space that we want and the freedom to explore that we want to have, even though it's going to look different. It's not going to be the same. But I think there was really nice connection between everyone's talk and a thought that occurred to me based on what we're doing with Anecdata is that another way to engage people is in information collection. You have that many people on the landscape they're seeing things. And they're in more places at more times than the scientists and researchers can possibly be. So I do love the idea of citizen science in our national parks, where observations are continually being shared, especially across time, because things every day look a little different depending on the weather, the wind direction, tide stage. You can't, I know for some of the work we do, we end up going out every month and taking a sample, or for some things like red tide blooms, we're out every single week. But imagine having data from every minute of every day. That's what people can do. So anyhow, I want to open it up if there's any other questions or any other connections that other people are seeing between these talks, because there's interesting intersections here.
Jane, this isn't exactly, where you were headed, but we had some great discussion in the chat. I don't know if folks are following that, but there was some conversation around, potentially incentivizing transportation for locals, right? That's another thing. We think a lot about the visitors to the island, but there's also this, local population that could potentially be motivated or incentivized to take some action as well. And then Jesse, I was thinking of you. Dave asks a question about invasive species here in the chat. He says, they're increasingly entering a variety of areas, especially those affected by climate change. Have there been any studies demonstrating the potential for prediction of them? Going further, when such studies take place, it could help not only prediction, but preparation of the environmental area as well.
That's a great question. There certainly have, this makes me think of, and I'm not sure if this is exactly what Dave you're trying to get at, but think of what are known as sleeper species, which it could be our non-native species that are on the landscape already, that aren't necessarily, don't have an invasive behavior yet. But one thing that climate change can do is change the conditions enough, either of its own right biology or the competitors or that community that it's involved with, to where it may become invasive. And so that's a little bit of an emerging kind of field of study, but that's something that this regional group I mentioned is certainly looking at, and there are folks looking at what of those sleeper species do we need to be concerned about, as and predict how they're going to be affecting the landscape. But those that are already known to be invasive to our south, there's definitely a lot of work with trying to limit their spread. Like the state of Maine has like a list of species that are illegal for sale in the horticultural trade, for example. And a lot of that regulatory is based on species that may not even be established here yet, but that are established in invading areas to our south. So anyhow, good question. Good question there. Thanks.
I want to say something about the invasives. So some of our work has been, it's not a tightly woven issue with climatic change, but the emerald ash borer is an issue that we've been dealing with in the tribal community for a while. Just a couple of things. I'm a social scientist, so the modeling spread of invasives was really important to our work with EAB, because it was first discovered in Detroit area in 2002. And we really used some of those models. But one of the things in terms of policy response to things like invasives, and I think also there's some commonalities with climate adaptation work, has to do with what you can accomplish and whose knowledge and whose response you can mobilize before it happens. And then after it's already happening, the policy options and the social options greatly reduce. For example, we came together as Wabanaki communities and researchers to say, this invasive is going to impact us the most. It's a climate justice issue in terms of who uses ash trees the most in Maine, whose culture is it most important to. It's Wabanaki people. It's what we make baskets out of. It's part of one of our creation stories, that sort of thing. So we know that already. It's kind of a justice thing, but also in forest policy as it relates to invasives, they use, and USDA, NEFA, they use command and control structures, very hierarchical structures in terms of response. And what those structures do is they prevent people who are not already considered kind of expert responders or have huge resources like big industry. They prevent any of those forces, social and cultural forces, to enter into the decision framework. So we learned by looking at in some Midwestern states where the EAB was really, really impactful, where they have even more tribes and more people using it, that the tribes were really locked out, because by the time there was sort of a tribal engagement, it is already discovered there. So we used the years that we had in terms of our research to develop a policy and social research infrastructure to respond in a way that brings in multiple voices. And so we see the impacts of this now as the decision-making framework here in the state of Maine, as we're the only state now because EAB was delisted last year anyway, this whole thing. But it's the only, we're the only state that sort of has tribal engagement in terms of decision-making framework around where to set quarantines, for example. So in Northern Maine, that's really important that's a key location of gathering for our brown ash, black ash resources, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of want to put a social and policy kind of element into it, because and which makes it even, I think we always feel like we're way behind the ball in the policy response, right? In terms of, people aren't acting about climate enough. But if you think about what we actually need socially, culturally to fight the justice elements of it, we need even more response time. And so many of us, of course, are very concerned about that.
Fascinating.
I think that no matter how you're going at this, that inclusiveness is so important, and that, whether you're talking about looking at tourism, or you're, trying to get people to weigh in on what they value in the park so that you can make decisions about whether you're going to direct this way or that way, or, whether you're trying to bring together, a whole nation of people and give everyone the opportunity to talk. I love that everybody talks. I think that it takes more time. It takes a lot of time to give everyone the chance to talk and to figure out how other people want to weigh in. And I am guilty myself, as you know, Jerry, of rushing to the point, and wanting to get the job done. And I think it just never really works out as well as when you get everybody together on the same page. We have a lot to learn, I think, from our native populations who have, practiced this for eons. But I don't know if anyone wants to speak more to the power of taking time, even when you feel like you're running out of time.
I can add something to that, and I guess one of the example is we've also been working, doing a lot of research to try to figure out best restoration methods for our summit areas. And what I mean by that is where there's been a lot of foot traffic, but also climate change disturbance events that have eroded soils and fragile vegetation on top of these summits. And so there's been some look at like how do we restore the soils and vegetation there. And we're kind of in a second phase of that right now. And I think we're really trying to focus this year on, let's step back a little bit and it takes time to learn, look at data that come out of that, but also engage others and try to be a little bit more collaborative in our approach. And also just like, taking a step back and trying to talk with other folks, other partners, other experts, other researchers, for such a complex and challenging thing where there's not a lot of like prescriptive protocol for what's going to work here. It works somewhere else. And so that's been a challenge, I'll just say, and I hope that we can continue to bring in more partners in that and engage for adding to getting, what are the values there, the resource values that people consider, and doing decision making and getting common kind of goals.
Yeah,
Oh, go
Lydia.
ahead, Darren.
No, I want to hear from you. Sorry.
Okay, well, I was just going to piggyback off of that and say that those the participatory workshops, you hear, yes, it is an increased time investment, right, to collaborate and work with folks, but until you really do it, you maybe don't realize how much extra work there is, but then how rewarding it is to have like locally relevant solutions that are actually applicable, that actually meet all of the different needs and the values that the people who want to see this specific solution or whatever it is, it represents their values and sort of their identity as members of this community. So maybe it is more of an upfront time investment, but then I think once you get that input, the solutions become much more relevant and feasible to move forward.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the connection with the RAD framework, Jesse, too, in terms of the values. So one of the examples that is out there in Indian country and sort of tribal issues around climate adaptation, and we use it as a thought piece as much as anything. One of the tribes in Minnesota, their lake no longer could support a native species. The temperature was too high. So, what do you do in that scenario? You have to actually have a value framework to sort of figure out how to rat it out. Like what is what are the decision-making thresholds are actually more tied to values and what you want out of a productive landscape than they are about pretty much anything else. I mean, I could offer a critique around sort of, American Western land management that's just built up around stasis and all that. But we'll set that aside for a second, and that doesn't include human beings at all, right? Let's set my critiques of all those things aside for a sec. But for this tribal community, they can't. There was a decision to say we need the protein and the connection to this lake to support us. So they over a few years, recognizing that the native species are no longer able to reproduce in effective ways, it's just too warm for them, they may face a decision about restocking. So simply because they knew that connection to the food source was critical, the connection to that place was critical, and as an orientation, they also engaged in a cultural framework of decision-making where they had ceremony to say goodbye to the native species of fish, a collective sort of decision-making framework to welcome the new fish. The idea that this is, this is a framework of ongoing observation around ecosystem components and decision making based on a long-term environmental change. And the fact that we would be like, oh, we need this new framework of RAD to be like, no, we don't want to keep rebuilding the same environment because all we know is stasis and all we know is that. It just, your interrelationship with the place and your values as it relates to it is what can drive these decision-making frameworks. I guess that's my kind of the baseline point around that.
Fascinating. That could definitely come to play here in Acadia, where there is such a value of place. I think that makes a lot of sense.
And a bunch of regulations around changing anything. Like it has to be stuck in, 1920 when it was created. So it's a very tricky framework.
Yeah, well, that's actually a great segue to a question that we have in the chat, which is the Maine MDR is not permitted to consider greenhouse gas emissions in considering lease applications. Of course, this makes no sense to me. Local governments also seem hesitant to consider climate change concerns in permit considerations and land use ordinances. How would the speakers recommend getting our governmental bodies to take action? Any takers? If we could solve that one.
I do not have a solution, but I will start off the conversation. And I think this has been mentioned in the presentation, but I'm a big fan of that bottom up pressure from locals. So whatever that looks like, if it's your town, if it's a, you know, a group of stakeholders, for example. I think that's where a lot of the climate change action is happening. And it might be, I think that might be where it's a little more stable as well, because you're not, you know, reliant on who is the governor or who is the president, right? You're sort of taking matters into your own hands. And of course that comes with challenges as well, right? Like local resources are maybe not as abundant as state level or national level. But yeah, I think organizing in sort of a more grassroots way can be a first step. And I don't know, Darren, I saw you nodding, and I think Jesse, I saw you nodding. I don't know if you all want to jump in to contribute.
I think the implication of that is correct. Innovations that happen in local, even with just a single permit, can, you know, something around that can be mobilized around. I mean, we've seen that in you know, and again, I'm a teacher and student of environmental justice, right? So there have been frames and reframes, but you know, the structural pieces are tricky for sure. You know, and I know various administrations have also in the top-down parts of this have been talking more recently. I think at the federal level, of course, it's being blocked. Just even a most recent case around the Clean Water Act, sort of the reimagining of it. So I think, yeah, I think again, I think communities in Maine along the coast that are facing particular challenges can mobilize around a story. I think that could be really important as impacts start to take, you know, I think there is going to be this, and I think Jesse talked about it, that sort of the A part of this Goldilocks scenario, you know, the kind of that ability to kind of articulate what is being lost because of inaction, and then mobilizing around action. You know, obviously concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere hasn't had the kind of impact. That story hasn't sold particularly well with across our populace. But as we lose, you know, coastal cities and communities and working waterfronts and these things, right, that, you know, things will shift. I think it's just, for many of us, that's going to be perhaps too late for the kind of impacts that we want. But I do think, you know, coastal communities in Maine, the rate of the warming of the Gulf of Maine, you know, I think we have some real opportunities for telling a story that could be impactful.
Jesse, any thoughts on that?
I think that's kind of a tough one. I guess just to think about what I would suggest is to think about what our back to the kind of the values of and to bring it as local as possible. And so this could be, if it is an organization, what is our mission statement? And that's a lot of what I fall behind for as the Park Service. What is our mission? To preserve natural and cultural resources. And that doesn't change with our changing administration or changing Secretary of Interior. And so if we could kind of, it's a long-term challenge though. So if we kind of keep on track, and then helping our local governments, I guess if that's more of the question, really identify those resources that are under threat the most, and then just kind of galvanize in, you know, energies around that. And then if it's something that, like Darren's example of the, you know, the fish and the dying species of fish, and that, like, if it can't be, can't do resist and can't replace that, what are kind of our options that are going to be palatable to the community? But as far as to get action, I guess it's just getting people. I mean, I see folks, I don't usually do this, but like leading congressional delegation into the park, into areas where you can see firsthand impacts. And so I think that resonates with folks. It can't always happen necessarily, but for those deciders, those decision makers, getting folks as close to what you know, as they can, you know, viscerally to get that engagement with our fantastic resources here.
That's great. With that in mind, I mean, Jane, you touched on a point about the fact that we have such an opportunity with so many visitors here on the island to use that as a way to engage citizen scientists, as a way to educate, as a way to share stories, all of those things. And Jesse, I know the park does a lot of that work, but I'm wondering if there isn't an opportunity for, perhaps a broader conversation or a wider embracing of that concept and the fact that we touch so many people in a very specific way during the course of a year. And there may be really unique ways that, we can have this conversation with a broader group of folks. I don't know. It's always struck me that there's a really interesting opportunity there. How to implement, I don't really know.
But that's interesting. We'll say that our interpretive division, our visitor experience and education folks have tried with facilitated dialogue with visitors. So taking those opportunities to have like a very direct one-on-one or small group to really discuss, where are you coming from? What do you value? Like what in connecting to the resource that's less super structured, but even if it's just getting information out there for passing folks, I think is important.
And I think we're seeing very young children who are making a big impact too, like Greta Thunberg and all of the children that follow in her footsteps. And so I'm very big about, working with the next generation. I know it's, again, taking time, but in terms of the storytelling, Darren, I think these are things that we need to recognize, that kids don't always know how to tell their story, especially if it's a data supported story. And that's something that I've been trying to focus on in my work, is to just give teachers and kids those skills to take the observations and information and data that they have been collecting or that others have collected and build that story that's compelling. And then whether that's for who, who's their audience, how do they find that audience if they really want to talk to state legislators or they really want to make a difference? Because I've seen kids do it. There's more of them than us, it seems. And they certainly aren't jaded. They aren't stuck in any old models of thinking. So I hang a lot of hope on our next generation. I like to think positively rather than like, look at the mess we left them, but let's give them tools and skills that we're learning along the way and make them stronger. And I think we'll find our way.
That's great, Jane. That's a great way to end. I think I just want to say how much I appreciated, the perspectives and the input from each of you. It was a really engaging conversation. And I think a lot of practical takeaways, things to think about. Certainly, lots of room for additional conversation, I think, as we all learn how to navigate this new reality that we're in. But I really, really just want to thank each of you for sharing your thoughts with us tonight. I'd love to continue the dialogue, as you evolve in your work and thinking, and please keep us in mind, because we would love to revisit this conversation with all of you on a regular basis. It was terrific. Thanks, Jane, for leading the charge. Really appreciate your efforts, and to everyone. So thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. Just a quick reminder that our next Science Cafe will be on May 9th, and we will have, this is an MDIBL speaker, so we'll have Dr. James Godwin with us, and he's going to be talking about regeneration in humans, science fact or science fiction. So I hope you'll all join us again next month, and we really look forward to continuing the conversation about science in everyday life. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to our speakers. Have a great evening.